Hello everyone and welcome to the Duna episode of Lowne Aerospace 2, the second one. And by that I mean, I feel like that didn't need explaining. We're going to be doing a mission to Duna. I'm going to kind of talk you through it. It's going to be great fun. So here, you can see me starting off by constructing the Duna lander. We're using the lander can command pod with 4 drogue chutes and 4 side chutes, as well as a couple of solar panels to power it. We also have the Science Junior there, and on it we're going to attach all of the science modules we have so far, which is pretty much all of them actually by this point, except for the breaking ground pieces, just because I'm trying to keep this game, this playthrough of the game, I should say, DLC free. I'm then going to add the smallest fuel tank of that diameter with the Terra engine, which as of right now, we don't have enough Delta V, because I'm then going to kind of bolster the amount of fuel we have with these peripheral side tanks. Just try and keep this lander a little bit lower. The taller your lander, the harder it is to land, because it will be more likely to tip over. But it also means it gives us a wider base onto which we can attach the 4 landing legs. And that's the basic layout of the lander done. We've got a couple of batteries. I put an antenna on it as well, but we didn't really need it, honestly. And a couple of monopropellant tanks just to increase our capacity from the 15 units of monopropellant that the command pod contains. And that's pretty much the Duna lander done. Of course, this is not enough to get back to Kerbin, and that's because we're going to be doing a Duna orbit rendezvous style mission, in that we're going to be sending a separate lander that will detach from the mothership to land on the surface of the planet, do everything on the surface, come back, redock with the command module, and then the command module will go back to Kerbin. So there's our lander design. Now it's time to construct the ship itself. So unlike the Apollo missions, which had a similar sort of thing to this, in that it was a separate lander going down to the surface of the moon, there's not going to be any reconfiguration of the vessel once we get into low Kerbin orbit. The whole thing is going to go to Duna pretty much as it was launched. We're going to attach the, using the Mark III command. I always want to call it the Apollo style command pod. We're attaching it below the Terra engine via a docking port. Docking ports also work the same as decouplers, so we don't need to worry about adding a decoupler in the mix. And then I'm just going to add a heat shield, decoupler, and then like a structural plate, a liquid fuel tank, and a nuclear engine. That's going to be the key drive to this mission, because we're going to be doing a lot of very high Delta V burns relative to the ones we've had to do thus far in our science playthrough. And so for that, the nuclear engine is really your go-to engine for all vacuum maneuvers, because it's very, very efficient. It's also very slow and heavy. Its thrust-to-weight ratio is terrible, but, you know, it makes up for it in the fact that it is the most efficient engine, except for the ion engine. And I guess some of the chemical rockets are a little bit more efficient in certain circumstances, but for all intents and purposes, it's our most efficient engine we have so far. Now we've got the main ship laid out. We're going to just attach it to a payload fairing base plate and just make sure the whole thing is strutted together. We're not actually done with the actual construction of the interplanetary stage, but that's it for the moment. I'll be making a couple of changes that you'll see in a second. I do want to talk about one thing. Oh, there's me checking the ladder. One thing I'm going to do, I'm assuming I'm going to do it in a second, is bind all the science modules to an action group. So all you have to do is press 1 on the keypad to do all the experiments. In this case, I'm actually binding the Mystery Goo and Science Junior units to 1, and then all the others to 2, just because the Science Junior and Mystery Goo have this sort of warm-up animation before they give you the science reading, and I find it annoying when they're bound in the same action group as the others. Very trivial, I know. So, as well as the science experiments, I'm also going to bind the solar panels to an action group so they can all extend in beautiful symmetrical unison. I do actually change those solar panels later on to the ones that can be retracted as well, just because although the ones we got are fine, because we're not going to be doing any aero breaks at Duna, I thought it might be useful just to have the ones that can be toggled, just in case, you know, we ended up with not quite enough Delta V to complete the mission without doing an aero capture at Duna. We could just retract the panels and then we should be fine, because Duna's atmosphere is tenuous enough to be able to aero capture without having to worry about needing heat shields or anything like that. So just in case you end up a little bit shy of the amount of fuel you need, you can now just retract the panels and it'll be fine. In this mission, we didn't actually need to do that, so we didn't need to worry, but there we have it. We have it just in case. And as you can see, hopefully it was obvious just from watching the footage, our main stage consists of a big orange tank with a mainsail engine, surrounded by 4 of liquid fuel rockets. So we're using the FLT 800 fuel tanks with some Reliant engines attached to them. We're going to, strap this to the main rocket itself using struts, but it's also important to make sure that you connect these side boosters to the orange tank using a fuel line, just to ensure that they're constantly feeding fuel into the central core at all points, so that when they detach, They leave the central rocket fully filled with fuel. This is just the most efficient way. Yes, I could have made it a little bit more efficient using asparagus staging before someone points it out, but we didn't need to do that in this case. This was fine, so I just left it like this, and it's a bit more realistic than asparagus. Now, as you can see, I had a couple of antennas to begin with, but I just deleted those, so don't put those on. But I'm adding this relay dish just here. And the reason for this is because the Duna lander itself will be piloted by Bob Kerbin, because he's a scientist, and as such, he can run the Science Junior and Mystery Goo units more than once, but he can't create maneuver nodes, which would be a useful thing to be able to do when it comes to docking back with the mothership. So by having that relay on the mothership, the lander can connect to it to boost its signal back to the Kerbal Space Center, and where it would have been previously out of range of the tracking station, that relay dish allows it to connect to the Kerbal Space Center, and Bob Kerbin can then create maneuver nodes himself. Now, speaking of the tracking station, after our last mission, we've ended up in a pretty good spot to get a Duna transfer window. If you were to draw a line from Kerbin to the sun to Duna, the angle that line would form at the sun should be about 45 degrees. And as you can see, we were pretty much there. Only had to do a little bit of time warp for us to get an optimal transfer window. But with that, I guess there's not much to say other than launch this rocket. So straight up at first, before gradually starting our tilt, aiming of course to be pointing 45 degrees by the time we reach about 10 kilometers, which will also be about the time those side boosters will have run out of fuel as well. We have all three Kerbals happily enjoying themselves, not knowing the terrible design flaw that many of you have probably noticed at this point. You see, whilst I remember to add parachutes to the Duna lander itself, I totally forgot to add them. There you go, the side boosters. I totally forgot to add them to the actual main command pod itself. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of a James Bond maneuver when it comes to re-entering at Kerbin. Luckily, Kerbals now come equipped with their own personal parachute, so it's no biggie. But I will be showing you how to recover science from the command module before it crashes into the ground, because obviously the command module will be where all the science is stored. So I guess it's not really that difficult of a problem, but at least I can show you what to do if you end up in a similar predicament to myself. Anyway, like I said, I'm not really talking too much about the ascents at this point in the series, because hopefully if you're attempting a Duna mission, and a Duna return mission at that, you've probably got a pretty good grasp of how to launch into low Kerbin orbit. And speaking of low Kerbin orbit, we are nearly here. As you can see, we've got a new science experiment. It's that atmospheric analysis machine, which we've never used before. And so we ought to at least run it once whilst we're at Kerbin. So I'm going to run it from Kerbin's upper atmosphere, just to give us a little bit of extra science points. It's safe enough to do an EVA at this point, so we can just go ahead and download the data immediately and then get ready to perform our circularization burn using the second stage, which is powered by the Skipper engine. I feel like the Skipper and mainsail engines are very underappreciated engines, because most people that play Sandbox, you know, will just use things like vectors and mammoths for their lower stages, and people that use the play science mode, once you've unlocked vectors and mammoth engines, they're pretty like redundant in terms of engines, especially now with the Mastodon, which was added in the Making History pack. I very, very rarely use mainsails and skipper engines anymore, except in circumstances like this where I'm restricted by a limited tech tree, which is obviously what the point of this series is. So, by the way, here we are in low Kerbin orbit getting our Duna encounter. Basically, just create a maneuver node that costs about 1,100 meters per second, and then take a look at the map screen. Just grab the center of that maneuver node and just spin it around Kerbin's orbit, watching those grey indicators that will tell you how close to Duna you are. Just get them as close as you can, and then just tweak with retrograde and prograde, and you know, it's pretty easy to get an encounter with Duna from Kerbin. If you can't get a direct encounter straight from Kerbin's sphere of influence, then just get them as close as you can, and we can do an interplanetary correction burn on the way. I apologize for being so vague, but I always found that, you know, a hands-off approach to teaching maneuver node is generally the best way. I mean, there are tutorials in the game that walk you through it. Really, the way I learned how to do it is just sitting on the map screen and playing around with the maneuver node maker, and you can just kind of get a feel for how it works, and then once it kind of clicks, it's pretty easy to then replicate. So I'd recommend just playing around yourself. But our maneuver node is all plotted, we have reached it, and we can start executing. Well, we started executing it already as well, didn't we? So yeah, nuclear engines, very, very slow engines compared to the ones we've used before, especially because we've only got one engine as well. So I've sped the footage up as fast as I can in Sony Vegas, and we've also got physical time warp going at maximum as well, and we can just watch our apoapsis rays. as I say, the very last minute, sort of 10 meters per second to go, we're just going to close that maneuver node and burn the rest of the way manually, just so we can fine-tune our approach, because sometimes the maneuver nodes don't get it quite dead on. So just in the last bit of the burn, close the maneuver node and just watch those grey indicators approach yourself. And then we can create another maneuver node about halfway along our interplanetary journey, and using anti-normal and normal we can correct the inclination and try and aim to get ourselves on a nice equatorial Duna orbit. Equatorial will be important to aim for because it makes it far easier when it comes to docking with the command module in orbit once we've finished all of our surface antics. So yeah, I guess we can just time warp up to that maneuver node and get ready to execute it again. In fact, we overshot it very slightly, so our perhaps this is not going to be probably quite the same as the one we planned using the maneuver node maker. So what we're going to do is just set Duna as our target and just watch it, and it's pretty good. Duna's atmosphere ends at 50 kilometers, so as long as it's above that level, we should be fine. So we can do a little bit of fine-tuning of that periapsis. Once we've entered Duna's sphere of influence, by the amount we need to edit it, it's going to be fine to just do it using radial in and radial out once we've actually entered Duna's gravity well. Speaking of which, here we go, entering Duna's sphere of influence. We can see it there on our horizon. All I'm going to do is point radial out, just aiming to aim my periapsis to be about 70 kilometers above the surface, just because that seems like a nice round number. I don't like to get things too precise, especially in the context of a tutorial. Having a little bit of extra wiggle room above the edge of an atmosphere just gives you some space in case you don't quite get your burns dead on. You know, some people have criticized this series because I say, oh, make sure your kerbin apoapsis is about 80 kilometers above the surface, and they say, oh, but to maximize the overbirth effect you should be getting it at least, you know, dead on 70. And for that I say, this is for beginners, you know, and also, you know, you don't complete all burns instantly. You spend a little bit of time either side of your apoapsis doing your circularization burn. So you want to create a bit of space to allow yourself time to do the burn. So 80 kilometers is a great one to aim for if you're just starting out in the game. Likewise, when circularizing at Duna using engine burning, 70 kilometers is a really good height to give you lots of room without risking plopping your periapsis too low when lowering your apoapsis. It's also very useful when doing rendezvous with your lander once you've left the surface of Duna and are trying to get back to the command module. When you're trying to modify your orbit to catch up with a command module, sometimes you can end up inserting yourself into an orbit that's slightly lower than the command module, and so you want to be able to create a bit of space to be able to do that without risking entering the atmosphere and slowing down too much and going crashing into the surface of the planet again. So as you may have just seen, Bob Kerman's done a bit of science, as has Bill Kerman, I think. Was that Jebediah? It happened too fast. We did a bit of science from space near Duna. What I actually forgot to do, so this is a pro tip, is I forgot to do some science as soon as we entered Duna's sphere of influence, that we could have gained some extra science from space high above Duna. I forgot to do that, so we actually lost some science points there. So before I put myself on a landing trajectory, I just made sure that Bob Kerman did all the experiments from low Duna orbit, just so we can get some science from space near Duna. Now we've entered the atmosphere, we're going to quickly run the experiments again to get science from the upper atmosphere of Duna. Be very quick, because although we're in the atmosphere of Duna at the moment, it's very thin in general, but especially at this height, so we should be fine for the moment doing EVA. But we don't want to spend too long faffing around out here. We want to get back into the safety of the command pod and coast our way down. Now, with the actual weight of this lander, coupled with the fact that we have 8 parachutes, 4 of them being drogue, 4 of them being very big, we should be able to land pretty safely just using parachutes. But I'm still going to recommend doing a little bit of engine burn just before touchdown, because the current parachute configuration that we have will put us on a touchdown speed of about 10 meters per second. You want to try and lower that to at least, I'd say about 1 meter per second would actually be a more sensible speed to be aiming for, especially if you're landing on a slightly rougher piece of terrain than I am. I'm currently landing in the Midland Sea as the main parachutes deploy, and now we've slowed down our descent quite a bit, we can get ourselves on EVA and run some science experiments from the lower atmosphere of Duna. So we can do EVA report, crew report, all that good stuff, and then get ready to do some science on the surface itself. if you really want to maximize the amount of science you can get, try and aim for one of the canyons on Duna, just because then it's really easy to find where all the other biomes are, because generally the base of the canyon, the slope of the canyon, and kind of the top of the canyon will be 3 separate biomes, so it'll be really easy to just get your kerbin on an EVA or even puddle hop with the lander to get more science. As you may be aware, in this series I've gimped myself in that I'm only allowed to take science from 1 biome per planet or moon, so that wasn't really an option for me, but it's there for you if you wanted to do that. There is a little bit of extra delta V in this lander for what we need, just to enable that, and also to kind of give you a little bit more extra wiggle room in case your ascent from Duna is not quite as efficient as mine, although mine is not hyper efficient by any stretch of the imagination. Bob Kerbin, not being one to waste time, sets upon the most important task of this mission, and that is, of course, planting the Lowne Aerospace 2, the second one, Space Agency's flag. There it is. Beautiful, fluttering in the wind just there. Do make sure, I didn't actually show it there, but make sure you name your flag site after the biome that you're in, just to make it a little bit easier in the future when it comes to picking future landing sites, because you don't want to land in the same biome more than once, so that you can really maximize the amount of science you get. You know, if we were to go back to the Midland Sea later on and redo all the science experiments we just did, we wouldn't get as much science as we would get, say, if we went to something like Duna Lowlands instead. But that is pretty much all the things we need to do on the surface done and dusted. So now it's time to open up the map screen, set the mothership as our target by clicking it and press set as target, and just time warp till it's kind of just before it's above you, if that makes sense. So that kind of position on the map screen, that's the kind of distance I generally try and aim for when docking on above Duna. But your mileage may vary depending on the altitude of both your lander and the command pod itself. So I would recommend making a quick save before you attempt your ascent, and just being prepared to redo that ascent a few times until you can get an optimal encounter with the command pod in orbit. So because we're on an equatorial orbit and because we're orbiting with the rotation of Duna, we're going to be pointing 90 degrees along the nav ball, and we're just going to keep an eye on that abscess on the map screen. You can see our target is going to be slightly ahead of us, so we need to catch up to it. So we're going to try and enter a faster orbit, and the closer you are to the surface of a planet, the faster your orbital speed. So by having an apoapsis lower than the periapsis of the command pod means that we should easily be able to catch up to it. And since we're not that far away from it, we can probably catch up to it in just half an orbit. So we can just drag out our prograde marker there, and as you can see, we're going to get a nice and close approach, exactly almost half an orbit away. So it ended up working out pretty well. Like I say, I might have got a little bit lucky here. That's why I'd recommend doing quick saves before you take off, just in case you don't get quite so fortunate on your attempt. But you know, sometimes it's enough to just get into orbit and get kind of close enough and just play around with the maneuver node maker, making heavy use of the skip orbit button if you have to get your approach that way. But in this case, it was fine. I have done a very detailed tutorial about how to do orbit rendezvous like this. I'm going to put a link in the description. It's for the Mun, but I think it's quite good because it includes quick saves that you can use for reference, so you know that you're working with the exact same things that I have to work with. So once you've got that down, maybe come back if you are really, really struggling. But it is, like most things in Kerbal Space Program, not really something I can teach you. It's just something you teach yourself by doing it over and over. You'll get a knack for it. Anyway, we're doing my lazy method of getting our encounters by burning retrograde relative to our target once we're fairly close, within sort of 3 kilometers or so. Killing off all our speed, like I say, by burning retrograde, pointing towards our target, burning again, and then eyeballing it. So once you get fairly close, burn retrograde, kill off all your speed, then burn towards the target again, rinse and repeat until you're at a distance like this. Then we're going to double click on the target's docking port, just so we can be nice and precise with our aiming. We're then going to switch to the target itself and do the same thing again. So we're going to double click on the docking port of the lander, then click the target node on auto SAS, and then when we switch back to the lander, you'll see that the two ships automatically maintain alignment because both ships are manned. Then it's just a very simple case of coasting towards the target at low speed, and as you can see, even though there's a slight rotation, both ships maintain perfect alignment and we can dock without any problems or any need for monopropellant as well. So a successful dock, I hope you'll agree. But we've pretty much done all of the difficult things in this mission. Getting back to Kerbin is now going to be fairly trivial by comparison. Just make sure that to get Bob back into the command pod itself, go on a direct EVA rather than transferring, just so you can right click on the lander can, click take data, so he can store it in the command pod rather than leave it inside the lander, because we won't be taking the lander back with us, and so we don't want to be leaving all of the science we worked so very hard for stuck in space, or stuck burned into the surface of Duna, because unfortunately we won't be saving this lander. It's going to be deorbited and allowed to crash safely into the surface of Duna, thus not leaving any debris in orbit. But we can take the remaining liquid fuel just to give us a tiny boost of delta V for the main transfer stage back to Kerbin, and then we're going to do a deorbit burn using the nuclear engine just so it ends up on an atmospheric entry, which will eventually decelerate it sufficiently to cause a crash. Obviously make sure to burn prograde once you've done this to make sure that your command pod does not do the same thing as well. And then we just want to think about getting back to Kerbin. Now, there is a correct way of doing this, which is waiting for a transfer window, which you can do either with mods like Kerbal Alarm Clock or using the website Transfer Window Planner, or you can do what I like to do and just create a massive burn of like 2,000 meters per second and do the same thing we did before. So just keep spinning it around Duna's orbit until you can just force a Kerbin encounter. So although we're not at a transfer window to get an optimal Kerbin encounter, we have a ton of delta V that we can just kind of botch one by doing a really inefficient burn. This just means that our Kerbals don't have to spend quite so much time stuck in orbit around Duna waiting for a Kerbin encounter to occur. As you can see, those grey encounter indicators have sort of separated a little bit. We can just fix that on the way. They were quite close together when I planned that node initially. I think they just shifted when I started the burn for some reason, but you'll see what I mean. Oh, there they go. So by closing the maneuver node at the last minute, you can see they fixed themselves and they're pretty close. Not dead on though, so we'll have to do a correction burn in interplanetary space to fix that. So as you can see, we can just pan the camera down, see what our misalignment looks like, and as you can see, it's to do with our tilt. So we're just going to use the normal and anti-normal nodes to change our tilt a little bit, and as you can see, we get straight onto a nice Kerbin encounter. Now, because we did such a massive burn from Duna, it means we're on a very inclined orbit relative to Kerbin, so our re-entry speed is going to be very, very high. The more dissimilar your orbit around the Sun is to Kerbin, the higher your re-entry speed, and in this case, our Sun orbit is very, very different to Kerbin, so we're going to be going in very, very fast. Luckily, we got 800 units of ablator, so we should be fine. But it's just a word of warning. You can't really do this if you're planning to save more than... Well, if you're planning to save something that isn't protected by a thermal heat shield. But, you know, we've done the burn. Everything looks fine. So we could just time warp our way down to our Kerbin encounter and get ready to enter the atmosphere and land, which, of course, like I said earlier, will require some very brave personal parachuting from our Kerbals, because the command pod itself does not have parachutes. So I like to just decouple at the very last second, just so we can get some beautiful fireworks. Wow, nuclear engines really are resilient, aren't they? Beautiful fireworks from the rest of the ship where it succumbs to the heat of re-entry. And as you can see, Bill and Bob fainted at the gloriousness of those fireworks. Luckily, Jebediah remains rock steady and didn't fall unconscious under the massive G-forces. And it was at this point that I think the Kerbal started to realise that they would have to do the final bit of deceleration themselves. So in order to save the science, you go on EVA, right-click the pod and try and click Take Data before the Kerbal gets whisked away by the aerodynamic forces. So we didn't manage to do it with Jebediah. We'll have another go with Bill. And as you can see, we did it! I wasn't too stressed at that point because we still had Bob Kerman left to go, but it's nice to not have to worry about doing it with the very last Kerbal. So look at that, all Kerbals are safely evacuated from the command pod with many, many hundreds of meters to spare. Obviously we've made sure that all of them have their parachutes deployed, and now it's just going to be a case of coasting them all down to the surface. Luckily we're on land, so they can do we've still got a chance to do a nice photo shoot of them all landed on the surface together, standing together. I don't know, they can have a sit down whilst they wait for rescue. They haven't got just sort of float there waiting for a rescue boat to come and get them. So yeah, Bill and Bob are safely together. Now it's just Jebediah's turn to cruise his way down. And, there's a weird glowing tree there. Cruise his way down and meet up with his friends on the surface. Very graceful touchdown from Jeb there, as always. A little quick waddle up. And there they all are, united once again. And then they just sort of stand there and wait for sunrise, completely motionless. Beautiful. What a lovely shot. But without further ado, I think you know what's coming next. It's time to recover. Bill is the key because he's got all the science. And I want to see how much science we've got. 2,778.8 science units earned. Pretty successful mission, if I do say so myself. Before we head to the R&D facility, we should probably go to the tracking station and just recover Jebediah and Bob as well. But now it's time to take a look at the pieces we can unlock. So we've got all the science units we really need, so now I'm just going to spend some of the money to get the nice big rocket parts. I'm not going to use the actual Saturn V pieces though, just because they're from the Making History DLC, and I'm trying to keep this playthrough DLC free whenever I can, so you know, we can still use the one other big tank that isn't from DLC in that last tier there. And then it's just a case of taking a look at what we need to unlock next. So in order to finish unlocking the tech tree, assuming we get the same amount of science that we just got from Duna from the next missions, we should have the rest of the tech tree unlocked in between 3 and 4 missions. Then there's about 8,000-ish science points remaining, as in like required to unlock the remaining nodes. So, you know, only a few more episodes. So it's up to you guys now. Where would you like me to go in the upcoming episodes? Let me know in a comment. And on screen, there are some links. On the left is a link to the full playlist for this series. On the right was a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm. There is also a link to subscribe and check out my Patreon if you would like to. And in the description, you'll find a link to my Instagram, merchandise, and Discord. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.